Today's conversation is about the current situation, Gaza and Israel-Palestine conflict. And I would request Daniel to introduce. So, hello everyone. Get to another conversation from the platform of Untold Diaries. Today we are very fortunate, and I am personally very excited to have a very dear friend over from Madrid who will be talking to us about the current situation in Gaza and Israel and the conflict related over Palestine. And my friend who happens to be a professor in architectural history and thought, his name is Daniel Mielgo. But in the interest of time, I will let Daniel introduce his professional and educational journey and his interest in the area. So over to you, Daniel.
Yes, thank you for having me, Bina. As you said, my name is Daniel Mielgo. I am a graduate in architecture and a teacher in architectural theory and history. I've also done extensive research in architectural issues and also in the Middle East, where I've visited the area, of course, and I've had a keen interest in this conflict for a while. So I guess my interest in this stems from way back, and I've been looking into this conflict for some time from the point of view of a Spaniard, really, because I do think that our interest in this topic should relate to our political relation towards the conflict. Americans should approach this issue as American citizens, Israelis as Israelis, and so on. I happen to think of it in terms of European citizens, since the European Union happens to have a degree of responsibility in what's happening and in what's been happening for a long time. And that's basically where my interest in this issue comes from. Now, as for the current situation in Gaza, I think it's worthwhile contextualizing what happened on the 6th of October, because the mainstream narrative in the media about this incident or these crimes, and there's no doubt that there were very significant crimes that occurred on the 6th of October in Israeli territory. The current narrative, as I said, was to set the clock from that day onwards, as if this happened in a vacuum. I have actually with the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, who said at a Security Council meeting that these events did not happen in a vacuum. So without providing a lot of history about the Gaza Strip, and we know, your listeners should know that the Gaza Strip was a creation of the State of Israel, really. It was, prior to 1948, a rather prosperous Palestinian area, lovely beaches, so rather functional economy, actually, and it's difficult to imagine it these days, but it was a rather idyllic location for many Palestinian families. With the war of 1948, there were approximately 300,000 refugees from villages that had been taken over and destroyed by the nascent Israeli state that ended up in what's now the Gaza Strip. That accounts for the fact that of today's population in Gaza, which is approximately 2.3 million people, 70% of those people are either refugees or descendants of refugees. Over 50% of the population are children, that's to say boys and girls under the age of 16. Approximately 80% of the population of Gaza prior to the 7th of October depends on humanitarian aid for their basic survival. The unemployment rate is over 50% overall, and that amounts to approximately 60 to 65% for young people. I suppose the main background to the 7th events, leaving aside the creation of the Gaza Strip from 1948, and then Israel started colonizing or building settlements, small settlements in comparison to what it was doing elsewhere, but there were no less illegal Israeli settlements after the Six-Day War in June of 1967. Settlements, Jewish settlements, Israeli settlements there began in 1969. But it was really in 2005, I think, where the current situation in Gaza began to be extremely dramatic. Some of your listeners may recall that that year, the then Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon announced, with a few years before actually, but it implemented the so-called withdrawal from Gaza. That's to say that the Israeli settlements there were dismantled and the Israeli military withdrew from Gazan territory. It's interesting to point out what the purpose of that was in the context of the Israeli occupation. Every Israeli observer and knowledgeable people on this conflict knew straight away that the withdrawal was basically an expansion of Israeli settlements into the West Bank. In fact, on the very same day that Ariel Sharon announced the withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, approved thousands of new building licenses in the West Bank. So it made no sense from an Israeli point of view to preserve some 5,000 to 7,000 settlers in Gaza, where it could expand very easily into the West Bank in areas that were far more interesting to them. As Ariel Sharon himself said, the withdrawal from Gaza by Israel was, and I'm quoting him now, vital for the assurance of lands that are vital for Israel's existence. Those were Ariel Sharon's words. And it's no wonder that the withdrawal of Gaza was announced, planned, and executed in conjunction with the so-called separation barrier that Israel had been building for a while and is still building in the West Bank. Also worth reminding your listeners is the fact that in the summer of 2004, the International Court of Justice considered a case brought forward by the Palestinian Authority condemning this war, and the International Court of Justice ruled in favor of the Palestinian Authority. It condemned the war as a de facto annexation of occupied Palestinian territory, and that's approximately 80% of the course of the war. Anybody who's seen the wall in East Jerusalem, for example, can very clearly see what the court meant by that resolution. And needless to say as well, of course, that the Israeli government and the Israeli state at large dismissed the court judgments with total contempt, and the wall is still there. So anyway, back to the withdrawal in 2005. The next relevant event leading up to the current situation was January of 2006. And at that time, there was a free election held in Palestine, in the occupied territories and in the Gaza Strip. And the contestants to that election, the main two contestants really, were the ruling party of the current Palestinian Authority, PLO, that's to say Fatah, and Hamas. Hamas, I should say, is a national liberation organization that emerged in the late 80s, actually in 1987, supported at the time by Israel. Israel bankrolled Hamas for a very long time until it committed the major crime of winning an election in January of 2006. That's when all the alarm bells went off. And the international community, of course, reacted with panic because the wrong people had won the election. There's no doubt whatsoever that the election was fair. It was monitored very carefully by international observers, among them ex-US President Jimmy Carter, who wrote a report on the elections, considering them a clean and fair election, and Hamas had won hands down. Well, after that, Israel stepped up the tension by introducing a massive blockade of the Gaza Strip, cutting off supplies, delivery of food, water, and so on was severely restricted. Hamas lived up to a kind of ceasefire. There were a few skirmishes in the border, as usual. But it's worth reminding your viewers that the logic has been the same ever since 2006. Israel incites a certain level of provocation, which elicits Hamas response, like, for example, firing rockets into Israeli territory. And that in turn allows Israel, or it provides the necessary pretext to carry out a larger military operation of collective punishment, really. Well, Israel began with several operations. They give biblical names to these routine operations, which in Israel received the name of mowing the lawn. That's to say, we have to teach Palestinians that they cannot raise their heads, literally, So, for example, the first operation was in the year of 2006. It was called First Rains. Then there was another military operation called Autumn Rains, and so on. The first major military operation at a large scale, which attracted a lot of international attention, was in December of 2008. You'll remember that there was an Israeli soldier, Gilad Shalit, who was captured by Hamas in the border of Gaza. The previous day, I should say, Israel had kidnapped two Hamas members in the West Bank. So the capture of Shalit, who was an Israeli soldier, in occupied territory, because I should say in parentheses that Gaza, despite Israel's withdrawal in 2005, continues to be under international law an occupied Palestinian territory. That's the opinion of the international community at large, including the International Red Cross. It continues to be the occupying power because Israel controls the airspace over Gaza. It has total control over the waters, and it has control over the land barriers and frontiers of Gaza. And it's created a so-called security buffer prior to October 7th, created a security buffer within the land of Gaza, where it has military outposts to control human traffic to and from Gaza. So it is the occupying power. So it means that the capture of an Israeli soldier is not as worse a crime as the capture of two civilians, as Israel did the previous day.
Yeah.
But just to contextualize this a little bit, Bina, and a lot happens in Gaza that we hardly know about outside of Israel and other media. But Israel responded, of course, by launching Operation Cast Lead. That was launched on the 27th of December of 2008, taking advantage of the fact that at that time in the US there was a kind of window of opportunity because, if you remember, Barack Obama had just won the election and the change of administration was undergoing in Washington. And it finished, I mean, it took willful blindness not to see it, but it stopped right before Obama's being sworn into office in January, in the 17th of January, a few days before Obama took office. That operation was a hideous operation, which resulted in 1,400 Palestinians killed, approximately, use of banned weapons and so on. Just to give your viewers an example, Amnesty International published a lengthy report called 22 Days of Death and Destruction. So that was Operation Cast Lead. And just to cut a long story short, ever since then, Israel has been carrying out these routine operations of mowing the lawn. The next one was Pillar of Defense, again in 2012. Then there was the Great March of Return in 2018, where Israel gunned down peaceful protesters marching to the border of Gaza. Prior to that, in 2014, there'd be a Protective Edge, another hideous operation which resulted in over 2,000 Palestinians killed and so on. And the blockade of Gaza has been increased, was increased to an enormous extent, to the extent that, as I said earlier, 80% of its population depends directly on humanitarian aid, among much else, of course. But Gaza is really a torture chamber for its 2.3 million people. They can be considered hostages, in fact. And what took place on October 7th was basically an uprising. It's worthwhile to consider it as an uprising. This is by no means to condone what Hamas did that day. By the way, it's not very clear what happened, incidentally. If you take a look at Israeli media and newspapers, they've progressively been bumping down the figure of 1,400 killed that was announced initially. But we know for certain that among the dead, most of them, the overwhelming majority actually, were military personnel. There were civilians killed, of course. There were atrocities committed. And it's pretty clear by now, as being conceded by several Israeli newspapers, among them Haaretz, which is probably the most reputable one, that a lot of the damage committed on the 7th of October was created by Israeli military forces and Apache helicopters, US-made Apache helicopters that fired down Israeli civilians in the attempt to retaliate. So the events of the 7th of October are by no means clear. But what is clear is that it was used by Israel, certainly, as a pretext to carry out what is going on right now, And it was obviously an operation that was well planned in advance. This has
Right.
not been
Um,
improvised by the Israeli military.
Um, Daniel, thank you for that very interesting and a very in-depth and an insightful context into the situation. You've given us a very in-depth historical context to the whole situation, and I think couldn't have been better for our listeners and for myself even to understand the context. However, in spite of all this, in spite of all that you put down there, the facts, the references, how would you say or explain, or to what extent can you say with 100% confidence that Hamas is a US Israel creation?
I wouldn't say they are a creation of the United States and Israel. Hamas, as I said, was born out of the first Intifada in 1987.
That's right.
And it was a movement of national, and it continues to be a movement of national liberation. The only difference between, well, there are many differences actually between Hamas and Fatah. One of the major differences is that it is not a secular movement of national liberation. So obviously there is a religious element to Hamas that Fatah at least does not uphold. But beyond that, I think Hamas, here I'm using references of Western observers that have looked into this matter very closely. And I suppose the prime authority for this is a Harvard professor called Sarah Roy, who for a long time has been studying the activities of Hamas. Hamas have done a lot of things for the Palestinian people in a very, very difficult context, in the context of occupation. They have formed charities, social support groups. They have been responsible for paying teachers' salaries. They have set up clinics, aid centers. They've set up cooperatives. So, with some justification, or a lot of it actually, many Palestinians voted for Hamas because they saw a political movement which was deeply committed to the cause of the Palestinian people, more so than Fatah and the PLO, which were, well, their reputation among Palestinians had been decimated for decades of corruption and mismanagement. So the victory of Hamas in 2006 is very justifiable. It is explainable, and it can be explained by facts on the ground. And that continued to be the case until now. Hamas is not a terrorist organization, as the United States, the European Union, Israel, and Britain are bent on portraying. You see, when we describe Hamas as a terrorist organization, we have to understand that that label acts as a doctrinal slogan in order to cancel any analysis of what Hamas is. Once you refer to a group as a terrorist organization, that's it in the media. There's no room for discussion, no inquiry as to its grievances, or no inquiry as to why it does what it does. And it's, of course, true that Hamas has committed and is responsible for acts of terrorism. Who isn't in this context? Everybody is. But it's way more than a terrorist organization. I certainly think that it helps in no way at all to dispatch Hamas as a terrorist organization. It's way more than that.
So you at this stage are definitely not calling Hamas a terrorist organization, and from what it seems, from the from what you've been telling us about the context, that in a way, living in this part of the world, Hamas has evolved into. So, what is the current entity of Hamas? If it's not a terrorist organization, and you're also saying it's now leaning more towards the extremist mindset, the Islamic mindset, it's something what we experienced here sitting in our part of the world when the Russians were here and the Mujahideens were created with the help of the Americans to fight the Russians, with the help of the Pakistani army and the Pakistanis. Mujahideens then became West's heroes, and
Mm.
eventually their children, Taliban, the disbanded Taliban once the West decided when the Russians were out. So there was this interesting transformation, identity transformation of a particular group from being the saviors to terrorists eventually.
Well,
So,
I think
are you saying that Hamas has gone through a similar trajectory of identity transformation?
no, I don't think so. I think, to be fair, the comparison between Hamas and other groups, not to speak of the Mujahideen, is unhelpful. They have nothing to do with the Mujahideen, certainly nothing whatsoever to do with ISIS,
They've
no matter
compared
how
them
much
to
is written.
ISIS, right? The West has compared
But
them to ISIS. The West
uh,
has compared them with ISIS, right?
yeah, as I said before, the comparison is totally unwarranted, and it's a form of cancelling any discussion or analysis or understanding, for that matter, of what Hamas is. Hamas is not ISIS. They have absolutely nothing to do with ISIS. Um, Hamas is a movement of national liberation. We have to understand that. It's a movement of national liberation, but it's a non secular movement. And it started off as such, and it's continued to be a movement of national liberation. It's often said that Hamas is bent on the destruction of Israel. And it's true that the charter of Hamas has a statement that Israel should disappear, or words to that effect. Firstly, that charter was written in the context of the First Intifada by a few clerics. It has really very little status in the current activities of Hamas. Incidentally, if we're looking at charters, we should look at the charter of the current ruling party in Israel, Likud, or at least its
Yes,
president, which
yes.
is Harut.
Tell us something
And
about that. Yeah.
their charter states that they're the originators actually of the phrase "from the river to the sea." That's to say that from their point of view, Eretz Israel, or the land of Israel, should stretch from the bank of the River Jordan to the Mediterranean. That
Yes,
includes the entirety of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. That was actually assumed by Netanyahu's last address in the United Nations General Assembly, where he showed a map of the Middle East with no Palestine on it, just one blank space called Israel. So if we're talking about charters, then there's many people in Israel that believe that Palestine should not exist at all. But
yes,
leaving that to one side, what's most interesting for the current conflict, and one of the main reasons behind what's happening and what's been happening in Gaza ever since 2006, is that Hamas has repeatedly insisted on its willingness and its disposition to engage in negotiations with Israel for a peaceful settlement of the conflict based on the 1967 borders, which is the overwhelming international consensus and has been the overwhelming international consensus for close to 50 years. That is actually backed by the United Nations General Assembly year after year on resolutions with almost unanimous agreement, with the exception of the United States and Israel. I mean, your listeners shouldn't pay attention to me. All they need to do is to check the voting records for the peaceful resolution to the question of Palestine, which year after year the UN passes in its General Assembly. Now, the United Nations for over 50 years has been unilaterally blocking this settlement in one way or another, both in the UN Security Council and in other initiatives that have been put forward. But as for Hamas, they've clearly shown their dispositions to engage in negotiations based on that premise, the 1967 borders. Of course, that's not reported over here because, and in the West generally, because it's far more convenient to portray Hamas as a terrorist organization bent on the destruction of Israel. Anybody who believes that, even assuming the narrative, that anybody who believes that an organization like Hamas would have the capability of destroying one of the most sophisticated armies in the world, like the Israeli army, is simply not living in the real world, I'm afraid. Even if Hamas was bent on that, which it isn't, um, they wouldn't even, they wouldn't even exist. They'd be pulverized immediately. So it's a narrative that it's very convenient for justifying whatever Israel happens to be doing. So the argument of self-defense that's daily, daily invoked by the Israeli authorities and its apologists really stands no scrutiny, I'm afraid.
So, Daniel, I mean, another interesting scenario that is emerging this time round in this conflict is that there's extreme polarization, not only between the Islamic versus non-Islamic countries, but even within the West itself. The West, the Western civil society, as take a case in point, Harvard and other Ivy League universities, look at the big demonstrations that came out in London, Washington, Sydney, and other Western capitals, and I'm sure in Madrid also. So
Yes,
that is a very interesting, development.
yes, it is.
How do you perceive that? How would you interpret that? And do you think it's
I
going
do
to
think
stop? It's just a response or a reaction, or do you think this is going to be something which will change the narrative to an extent?
I'm not sure it will change the narrative that much, at least for the time being. But I agree with you that it is probably the only hopeful development in what is going on. The scale of protests and solidarity with the Palestinian cause across the world has very rarely seen this scale.
Yes.
You mentioned Harvard just a moment ago, which is a case that I know quite well. I happen to have been a researcher at that university in the year 2008, 2009, when Israel launched its Operation Cast Lead, to which I referred earlier. At the time, I remember perfectly well, you could literally count with the fingers of both hands the number of people that were protesting on campus. I was one of them, and it was a bit embarrassing, to be honest with you, because there were hardly anybody. There was hardly anybody paying any attention to us, and we were a bit of a laughing stock. Now there are hundreds, if not thousands, of Harvard students protesting. And in fact, the Israeli so-called lobby or Israeli apologists have been so concerned by this that they've decided to stage some kind of congress in the States from Ivy League representatives who are actually claiming what a horrifying experience it is to be an Israeli in US university because they feel besieged. They feel besieged by Palestine supporters, which is, of course, a complete fabrication. But yes, I mean, there is a great deal of protest going on in the States. There's a great deal of social awareness that's been mobilizing. And that is a sign of hope because if the US administration can be pushed to change its policy, this time at least the damage can be ameliorated. And in the future, who knows? Continuing activism may force the US government, whatever it is, or the United States generally, to change its policy towards Israel. But I'm afraid that nothing will change if things don't change in the United States. It is so polarized, as you said, and so one sided that really the rest of the international community can do very little if things don't change in the US. That's really the main source of decision making power in this conflict, I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you. That sort of, yeah, and I think it's still as the situation is unfolding, I think that dynamics and the calculus of power is changing. However, since I was referring to some of your notes, so when you call it as the willful creation of the second Nakba, can you elaborate a little on that?
Yes, I mean, there's no doubt that what's been going on in Gaza since the 7th of October has already surpassed the scale of the first Nakba. Remember when
Yes.
over 750,000 Palestinians were forcibly expelled from their homes in the former Palestine,
Yeah.
and they were not allowed to return. That is really the smoking gun of an ethnic cleansing. It's not just the expulsion of a population, it's the incapacity of that population to return. So the fact that Israel has never allowed them to return is really what confirms an ethnic cleansing. Over 1 million people, 1.2 million people, were forcefully displaced since early October into southern Gaza. They are now in what used to be one of the most densely populated areas, if not the most densely populated area in the world. Now it's doubled that number of people in southern Gaza. So the conditions there are frankly unimaginable. And 80% of the infrastructure in northern Gaza and in the city of Gaza has already been destroyed. The population's been displaced, so there's no doubt that the intention is pretty willful. The intention of this massive destruction is to leave nothing for the Palestinians to return to. And in fact, during the short ceasefire, or this rather obscene expression that the community, the international community used, humanitarian pause, which was basically a pause in the slaughter, Netanyahu visited the destroyed northern Gaza area, and he said, as was reported in the Israeli press and in other media like Al Jazeera, today we lay the first stone of what will become the further land of Israel. So there's no doubt that the Israeli military will occupy northern Gaza. What will happen with the remaining 2.2 or 2.3 million people that are now confined in even much worse conditions in southern Gaza, we don't really know. What Israel intends to do with them is anybody's guess. They may want to leave them there with the intention of making their lives so unbearable that they will willfully leave southern Gaza into Egypt, probably. There's discussion of Arab countries taking a quota of Palestinian refugees, like they did back in 1948 and 1967. But to be honest with you, that is a despicable argument in itself. I mean, the same argument could be applied to
What's
Israelis.
your prognosis on that? Do you think they will be taking in refugees? Where we stand
Uh,
today, do you think that there is any inclination? I know, I think some countries like Egypt and even Jordan again have mentioned, are we willing to?
I think that there's no intention whatsoever from any of the Arab countries to take in Palestinian refugees. And to be honest with you, that they have a point. They do have a point. I'm not a friend of the Egyptian military junta that rules Egypt, but they do have a point. Their argument is, well, why should we take in refugees? This is Israel's creation. This is Israel's responsibility. Furthermore, refugees under occupied territory are the civil responsibility of the occupying army. Israel has no right whatsoever to do any of this. It doesn't have any right to lay a finger upon Gaza, let alone to do what it's doing. So why should other nations be left to clean up the mess? And furthermore, if we agree taking up refugees to make room for Israel in occupied Gaza, why shouldn't we apply the same argument to Israelis?
Yep.
That's to say, so in the port of Eilat, for instance, many thousands of, well, 2.2 million Israelis could leave the land of Israel. They could go to New York, for example, or Paris, many Jewish communities in France or elsewhere. What will happen with the fate of the people in Gaza, we don't really know. What we can know for sure is that a second Nakba has suddenly been created, which surpasses in scale that one of 1948. Whether they will be forced to remain in absolutely horrific conditions in the south of Gaza or whether they will be made refugees elsewhere is to be determined. Whatever the case may be, it's not looking bright at all for them. It's a humanitarian disaster, and certainly there are scholars who are already considering this as genocide. They're filing a case against Israel before the International Court in The Hague. Where that will go, we don't know either. It's little chance of prospering. And let's not forget that this is ultimately a war for the West Bank. Meanwhile, Israel continues its murderous operations in the West Bank, settlements, taking over whatever it can. It continues to harass Palestinians with illegal settlers in the West Bank. There's been plenty of violence since the 7th of October there. And there is speculation that Israel will at least take over the north of Gaza, as it's already done, in order to make way for the so-called Ben Gurion Canal, which is a water canal that will link the Red Sea with the Mediterranean. Northern Gaza is the most likely place for the canal to reach the Mediterranean Sea. We also know that Israel has already conceded licenses to exploit some of the substantial gas reserves that were discovered a few years ago in the coast of Gaza, in Palestinian waters, by the way. But of course, Israel's going to see the profits of that flow to its own purse. And this will continue, I'm afraid, unless policy changes in the United States are significant. Now, as we were discussing before, the only ray of hope in all of this is, excuse me, that policy changes in the United States will take place thanks to popular activism and pressure. Otherwise, we can only expect things to get worse, and it may well be that we are witnessing the death of a nation. It's that sad, but I'm afraid that's what the future holds if we don't do anything to stop it.
Yeah, yes. I think today, what the way the events have unfolded, it seems that the, the real intention of Israel and its big brothers, uh, it's quite sorry about that. It's quite apparent. And it's interesting that you just mentioned about these gas reserves, which are of extreme economic benefit to Israel or to its Western allies also. That was an interesting point you made, because we don't read much of that in the media, that their economic interests.
Yeah, I think the economic interests are certainly there, but I don't think it's the chief factor in what's been happening. It's certainly a prize, but it's a rather marginal one in comparison with Israel's greater goals. I should add actually that another possible deviation of what's going on, which is extremely worrying, is the conflict with other neighboring countries and the implication of other powers in this, which is on the cards likely, and it's not outlandish to think that, of course, the war may open up a new front in northern Israel with Lebanon. There's reports of skirmishes already between Hezbollah and the Israeli army. Hezbollah, I should say, is not like Hamas. It's much more powerful militarily. Jordan said that it's not going to accept any more refugees. There's been quite clear language on behalf of the Jordanian monarchy to Israel, saying that it will not accept the Syria, of course, has a dispute which is long-standing with Israel, with the Golan Heights. Remember, Syria is a strong ally of Putin's Russia. There are factors in the regions that may compel other agents to chip in to the conflict and to open up new fronts. And that could escalate to heights that we can only imagine. But if any of the great powers gets directly involved in this, we can only assume the worst will happen. So it's awful as it is already, but to even contemplate the intervention of any of the great powers directly on the ground is even worse. I should say, actually, that the United States is already implicated directly on the ground with a military unit that was sent specifically to Israel. When Joe Biden was there, he met them. And it's likely that there are US forces on the ground in Gaza right now. The United States has also sent aircraft carriers to the Mediterranean, and it's off the coast of Lebanon in order to keep the Lebanese and particularly Hezbollah in check. It's clearly a warning signal to Hezbollah saying, if you dare intervene, we will wipe you off the map, so to speak. There have been envoys, or rather carriers, Navy units from Britain as well in the Mediterranean that have gone there to pose as the great power. And there's even been deployment of Dutch troops involved in this conflict. So it does have the risk to rapidly escalate into wide conflagration. And I don't think anybody wants that, really. It could only be worse for the people of the region, particularly, and for everybody in general. Other than that, I think there's little prospect of any of the Arab powers to take a strong stance against Israel.
Not
Saudi
even
Arabia.
Iran? What's your take on Iran?
Well, Iran is, in some senses, it's a question mark. I should start by prefacing this with the fact that prior to October 7th, and for a very long time, the belligerent statements against Iran by Israeli leaders, military and political leaders, have been routine. I mean, Iran is considered a threat to the existence of Israel because it's deploying nuclear program. Firstly, Iran has ratified the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and there's no evidence whatsoever that it is developing nuclear weapons. Contrary to Israel, by the way, which is known to have hundreds of nuclear weapons and has not ratified the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Even Israel's prime whistleblower on this has been in solitary confinement for decades now. Mordecai Vanunu, his name is. So Israel is, of course, a nuclear power. It may even have hydrogen bombs by now. Iran, as far as we know, does not. And whatever you think of Iran, and it's certainly not a political regime that I favor, but its international record is one of non-aggression. Iran has not invaded anybody, and it's not planning to invade anybody, among other things, because the clerics in Iran know very well that if they do so, they'll be pulverized. It will be a perfect pretext for Israeli hawks and US hawks to launch an outright assault on Iran. But that doesn't mean to say that Iran may not get involved somehow if pushed. I don't think they will intervene. The sad truth for Palestinians is that no regional power is going to risk the perils of intervening in this conflict for the sake of them. So they are an abandoned nation. And I mean the great powers around, not the people. There's a difference between the political regimes in the Arab world and the people of the Arab world. Solidarity with Palestinians is enormous across the board, across the world, and especially across the Arab world. And it is easy to imagine why. But that doesn't mean, of course, that the Arab states are going to cooperate with the Palestinian cause. Off the cards as well is an oil embargo. There was speculation that Saudi Arabia may have imposed an oil embargo on the West, similar to what they did back in 1973 after the Yom Kippur War. So that's, a very strong tactical weapon that Saudi Arabia could have played, and they've decided not to. They were about to strike a deal with the Israelis, which looks more unlikely after this. I don't think Saudi Arabia will go all the way to signing a peace treaty, a permanent peace treaty with Israel after what's happened in Gaza. Among other things, because any peace treaty with Israel by now is going to contain compromises on the Palestinian question. So I think that's more and more unlikely. So we're looking at a very polarized environment. The United States and Israel, of course, stand alone in the world as far as the resolution of this conflict goes, and an ever-increasing source of tension. And of course, the West, by which I mean the United States, Israel, and Europe generally, their credibility has been completely shattered by all of this. I mean, the hypocrisy is just colossal.
Yes.
You compare the reaction to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which, whatever you think, that's a far more legitimate cause than what's been going on in Gaza for the last few weeks, is extraordinary.
Absolutely. And I think it's been exposed, as you said, it's quite black and white. And it's, as you mentioned, probably the only glimmer of hope would be the massive solidarity protests that we are witnessing worldwide. However, I don't know, personally, I feel it has to get to a scale where there's enough pressure that builds up even on UN bodies, even the International Court of Justice. As you know, that lawyers have already, some lawyers have they've gone to the International Court of Justice as an international crime. I don't know what's going to come out of that. I don't know. Frankly, I'm not, as of past few days, I have not been following that story. I'm not sure if you know if it's making any headway with this.
Well, I know there have been attempts by international lawyers, and there are underway to file a case against Israel for sanctions in Gaza. We know as well that the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Mr. Khan, visited Israel. He apparently showed a lot of interest for the crimes of the 7th of October, but no interest at all in what followed. So that's another obstacle, I suppose. But who knows where that will go? To be honest with you, even if the criminal court files a case against Israel and Israeli military leaders, and there's plenty of evidence against them, there's no question about that, massive evidence. The different thing is whether the court will be powerful enough to enforce a sentence, and that's almost off the cards completely. The United States will never allow that to happen, and Israel is ready to go to extreme lengths to ignore whatever resolutions international justice favors against them. We have a very good precedent with the 2004 verdict that I mentioned earlier regarding the so-called separation barrier. Israel flatly rejected it and ignored it and proceeded to build the wall regardless, among much else. So I think the only significance of that would be certainly symbolic, and that would be a reminder to future criminals that their actions are increasingly under scrutiny. You see, what's happened in Gaza over the last few weeks is it's quite significant, not so much in terms of scale, unpleasant to think about, but in terms of the scale of the crime, it's not that unusual. I mean, just to give you a precedent, I mean, in 1982, in June that year, Israel invaded Lebanon and killed probably about 15 to 20,000 people. Destroyed Beirut, at least southern Beirut and southern Lebanon. So this is certainly on that scale. But what's really new about it is that it's happening right before our eyes. Right before our eyes, we are seeing the crimes in real time, and we are really in touch with what's going on. And there's very little that people can do about it, which explains to a large extent at least, the wave of solidarity with the Palestinian cause that these atrocities have evoked around the world.
Yes. Before we wrap up, I have something. I think there are two aspects of this whole scenario that I would be interested in having your views on. One is the role of China, and the other is how will EU deal with this?
As far as the European Union is concerned, the answer is very simple. Whatever the US does, it may occasionally put a little bit of pressure, speak up in favor of the Palestinians very moderately. You'll remember, for example, the Spanish Prime Minister, Pedro Sanchez, who's going to head the European Union in a few months. He traveled there and delivered a speech at the Rafah crossing saying that he supports the Palestinian state and that the death of civilian casualties is unacceptable and so on. He actually met Netanyahu, and there have been diplomatic tensions between Spain and Israel over the president's words during his visit. But frankly, these are just very, very mild gestures. And you should remember as well that when the international community or the European Union claims that the solution is a Palestinian state, that sounds well and nice. But the question is, the Palestinian state, where? Where? That's the point. Where? If you look at the map of the West Bank, right now the Palestinian enclaves are reduced to disconnected cantons, and the areas that they have under their control is probably less than 20% of the former Palestine. So, do we really want a state like that? Yeah, I mean, it's worse than the South African Bantustans, really.
Oh, absolutely,
Actually,
absolutely.
Netanyahu, the current premier in Israel, had something quite helpful to say about this back in 1996. When he was first elected, he said, we'll take over whatever we want from the West Bank, whatever's left, the Palestinians can keep if they want. They can call it a state if they like, or they can call it fried chicken. Those were his words. They could call it fried chicken, meaning that whatever's left is completely insignificant. And one need only travel around the West Bank for a little bit, just a little bit, to realize what Netanyahu meant. Even if you go from Jerusalem to the Dead Sea and you cross the West Bank, you see what Netanyahu meant. There's the massive settlement of Ma'ale Adumim, which is a salient of East Jerusalem, which basically segregates the West Bank in two. And you catch a high-tech motorway that leads to the Dead Sea, and you look at either side of the windows in a bus or in a car or wherever you're driving, and you see Israeli agricultural land with Israeli markings left and right all over the place. So that's already been taken over. And that's just part of it. It takes an Israeli would take 10 minutes to drive from Bethlehem to Ramallah. It would take a Palestinian hours. That's assuming that he's not traumatized by Israeli checkpoints. So, I mean, what's the reality on the ground in the West Bank is increasingly bleak. And as I said before, I'm afraid this will continue unless policy in the US primarily changes radically. Radically.
Yeah. And if we have Trump coming in next, I don't see that happening. The only unpredictable factor within the U.S. calculus power, especially between the two parties and the people, would be the amazing, the growing resentment against the American regime, of the American people, vis-a-vis the policy in Israel and the genocidal, approach they have adopted. So again, we've come back to activism, right? It's the massive solidarity protests within the United States as well. And by the way, since you mentioned you were in Israel earlier this year, it seems that there's something brewing within Israel as well. The Israeli citizens, the younger people, who are
I honestly disagree with that, Bina. I think Israeli
really
society is profoundly indoctrinated. It is true that there are Israelis who are appalled at what's happening, but unfortunately, they are a great minority,
okay.
very small
Okay,
minority.
fair enough.
If you take a look at opinion polls ever since October 7th, there's massive support for the operations in Gaza by the IDF, to the extent that many people think that approximately 20% of the Israeli society thinks, or those that were polled at least, believe that the government's not going far enough in wiping out Gaza. They have a clear genocidal agenda. Some people protest on a technical issue, and that is because the tactics that Netanyahu is employing are not being successful in order to achieve the release of Israeli hostages, not because of what's happening to Palestinians, that they're concerned about Israeli hostages. Fine. I mean, I think families of those held hostage have every right to protest, but we should not confuse that with dissent towards Israeli policy in the occupied territories. It's very different. Other people are protesting against Netanyahu for domestic reasons, mainly his judicial reform, and there's speculation, and there's some degree of truth to it, that what's been going on in Gaza for the last few weeks is a distraction vis-a-vis the Israeli public of Netanyahu's plans to reform the judiciary system in Israel. So there's a lot of protest about that, but that's a domestic issue within Israel. It has nothing to do with changing Israeli policy toward the occupied territories and the Palestinians. So we have to be careful in dissecting Israeli opinion on this issue. Dissent, principled dissent on the question of Palestine is very, very marginal now in Israel. It's become a very indoctrinated society, a very belligerent society. And that's not surprising, given its degree
Yeah.
of
Well, I
militarization.
was also referring to a comment you'd made that Israel is also losing its own PR war.
Yes,
So, to
that's
what
certainly true.
extent do you feel
Israel is very well aware of the fact that it's becoming a pariah state. It's becoming a pariah state, and according to opinion polls as well, run by Gallup and other organizations, Israel ranks as one of the most hated countries in the world. And it will be ranked even higher after this, obviously, for pretty obvious reasons. It's despised, and they're very well aware of it. But the fact is, and this was something that was also invoked in the case of South Africa, apartheid South Africa, the only vote that counts is the US vote. So as long as the US keeps supporting Israel, nobody really cares what the rest of the world thinks.
And what about China? I asked you about China. What's
Yeah,
your
well,
China?
China is an important actor, obviously, but it's being considered. The region is off limits to China, basically. Nevertheless, China does have some margin of pressure, I suppose. For example, it could deliver massive aid by sea to Gaza. That's one thing they could do, although at the risk of being attacked by Israeli vessels or the Air Force, and that would open up a whole can of worms. But it's the same argument that I mentioned earlier with regards to Iran. I don't think any of the main powers are willing to sacrifice a major confrontation with the United States over this issue of Palestine. None of them will. China may be symbolically significant, may put some diplomatic pressure on Israel. But at the end of the day, in order to change the facts on the ground, I don't think it plays a vital role here. And I don't think China is willing to enter into any international conflict over it. They're too clever for that. That's my opinion.
Well, that's quite a doom and gloom situation for now for the Palestinians, especially the children, the civilians, and people, as they call it, the open largest prison camp. So,
Mm.
if in the event, if this genocide is they achieve their goal of Palestinian genocide, I don't think the world will be the same place. Daniel, I think that will be a huge tectonic shift in the calculus of global power and relationships of between the
Yes, I mean,
big Russia, China, America, Muslim.
my expectation is that Israel will continue with these operations until they get a phone call from the White House telling them to call it off. It's that simple. So pressure is building up in the United States. Pressure is building up on Biden and his administration to call this off. And as happened in other cases of mowing the lawn, if you look into it, they stopped when the United States told them to. That's as simple as that. I mean, the
Yeah,
line of thought is that direct. It would take a phone call from the Oval Office to
yeah.
cancel this atrocity right now.
I think
So
that's well
the
put.
Israelis have a window of opportunity and they're making the best of it. And they'll take it as far as they're allowed to by Washington.
So I think that wraps it up, and I kind of agree with you on that. That I think that's where it will end. That one phone call from the White House,
Yeah,
Pentagon, or whatever, to the Israelis to put an end to this. And we witnessed this before with some of the Latin American scenarios, and even in Afghanistan
yeah,
and Iraq, right? And
yeah.
yeah, so you destroy societies and people and institutions, and I don't know. I mean, it's such a large scale of destruction that it's but it's not something that fits in well. Let's say 30 years down the line, how here you have AI technology really taking over the world. I mean, look at the amount of they say data and human knowledge. It's a knowledge-based economy, so it's a big shift from the old economy to the new economy. Will we be witnessing another renaissance? It's almost like it's a hybrid situation of being in the dark ages as well as a period of enlightenment when it comes to
Yeah.
technological and scientific progress. So it's not the really typical dark ages that we witnessed way back, from 14, 15, 13, 14, 15 centuries, and then the Renaissance happened. But this is something, I think it's going to be a very different shift to a new state of human society, a new state of
No, it will. Eventually, it will.
yeah.
Uh,
So
slowly.
thank you so much, Daniel, for your time.
Okay.
Got a bit philosophical at the end because it seems that we are ending on a philosophical note, right? We don't have any strategic solutions to this. I mean, there could be strategic solutions brewing at the back end we don't know of, but I don't. They're not very apparent. Maybe. I mean,
Yeah.
how would you say that this is? Um,
I think we have to be quite pragmatic with the situation. I mean, there are many other things that are going on in the world, of course, but they're not necessarily related to this. I mean, the situation here is very clear. Is one of the things about the Israel-Palestine conflict that's attracted me, contrary to many illusions that you hear in the media, is that the simplicity of it. It's a
hmm,
very simple issue. The
hmm,
issue itself is extremely simple. It's perfectly understandable. The balance of forces is crystal clear.
hmm,
The solution is by no means ideal, but there is a huge consensus, as I said before. and there are two parties that systematically block it.
That's right.
And there won't be any solution to this unless that changes, and things can only get worse. The rest of the events that are going on in the world, yes, they're very significant, they're transformative and what have you, but they have absolutely no bearing on the crux of the matter here.
Right.
And when one looks at it that way, it's extraordinary how simple this is. It's difficult to resolve, but the issues are very, very straightforward. That's
Right.
my view.
Yeah, that's
Sorry.
very paradoxical. It's very ironical too. So thank you, Daniel, once again for your time, and we'll be in touch. Um,
Okay.
Not necessarily on this topic. Remember when I met you in Madrid this year, we also spoke about the idea of nation states, how relevant they
Yeah.
stay, and all that. So maybe, a couple of more conversations down the line, uh, depending on your convenience. So thank
Okay.
you. Thank you, Daniel, and have a
Thanks,
good
Lee.
day. And thank you again.
Okay.
It was a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. Same here. Bye bye.
Bye bye.